So we're going to finish up talking about histology. So we've already covered epithelial tissue, we've covered nervous tissue, and we've covered muscle. So all that's left is connective tissue. Well, connective tissues are a little bit different from the others, and that's why I saved them for last. There's a lot of them too. So let's look at some characteristics of them before we go any further. But look at what their functions are. They support, they protect, they bind tissues together. They also include things like bone, and then another connective tissue is blood. Well, think about how different bone and blood are. Bone is hard, it's stiff, it's rigid. And so it's very, very protective, it's supportive and all that. But think about blood. Blood is a liquid. It flows. So how different could you get between bone and blood, which are two also connective tissues? And so what we're going to see is it's not the cells that make a tissue and connective tissues different. It's something else. But here are some connective tissues. Connective tissues are all over the body. They're the most widely found in the entire body. They're the most common. And basically they're everywhere. And as I already said, they have a lot of different functions. Well, because they have different functions, they're also going to be the most variable. So we find them everywhere. They're the most abundant. They're also the most variable. So here are those functions. And again, think about how different this one is from this one, from this one, from this one. They're very, very different. And so something has to be making the tissues different. And what that is that connective tissues have matrix. So far the tissues that we've been looking at, like epithelial tissue, if you think about it, there's a cell, but right next to it is another cell, and right next to that is another cell, and right next to that is there's hardly any space at all between these cells. Same thing is true for muscle. Even nervous tissue is like that. But if you look at connective tissues, you might have one cell over here, so here's a cell, but you may not have another cell to way over here or way over here. Well, the space between them is not empty. This space is filled up with stuff. And whatever this stuff is going to determine the characteristics of this tissue. So if I look at bone, that was our example, bone is hard. And so this stuff is minerals. It's calcium and phosphorus and carbonate and things like that is minerals. But if you look at it for blood, this stuff in the middle is actually water. So it's not the cells that make them different. It's this stuff in the middle, and that stuff is called matrix. So connective tissues have more material on the outside of their cells out here than they do on the inside. So they have more extracellular material than intracellular. And that extracellular material, again, is called matrix. They also vary not only in their structure and so on, they vary in how many blood vessels they have. So some connective tissues have lots of blood vessels, and some connective tissues have absolutely none at all. So it's also quite variable. So here is a typical connective tissue. And so if we look at it, look, there's a cell right there, and there's a cell, and there's a cell. But look, they're not packed in there like these other tissues are. There's all this space in between. And so this space, again, is called matrix. Well, if we look at matrix, it has more than one thing in it. Matrix is composed of two things. One thing is called ground substance. So ground substance is the sort of the filler material. It fits in between everything else. It's sort of filler. It's unstructured. It fills all of the spaces in between the cells. And so we go back to this picture. That ground substance is this light blue that we see everywhere. This stuff, this light blue stuff. So that ground substance could be hard, it could be soft, it could be flexible. It just depends on the tissue that we're talking about. But there's something else inside this matrix besides ground substance, and that is there are fibers. So fibers, a good way to think about fibers is like carpet fibers. It's these long stringy things. Well, there are 3 different kinds of fibers. There's collagen, there's elastin or elastic fibers, and there's reticular fibers, and we can see them all in this picture. This big, thick one right here, this blue one, that's collagen. This sort of orange-looking one right here is elastin, and then these much, much smaller, harder to see ones, these light blue ones, those are reticular fibers. So if we look at this picture, we can see the ground substance. Remember, that's the filler material. It fills all of the spaces in between. And then here is our collagen, and there's the elastin, and then these are the reticular fibers. Well, that's just a picture. Again, same thing here. So look, here's our cells. So that's a cell, and there's a cell, and there's a cell. Look how spread out they are. They hardly touch each other. Now, sometimes they touch each other, but not much. And then we have all of this space in here between. That's matrix. All of that stuff is matrix. And again, matrix has 2 parts to it. It has this ground substance. That's this stuff right here, this. And then it's got fibers. And here are the fibers. And again, there's 3 types of these fibers. Well, this is also another drawing. Let's look at a real picture. If we look at a real picture, it would look like this. So look, there's cells right there. There's cells. Here's the ground substance in here. This stuff, this ground substance. And then when you look in here, we're going to see fibers. So let's go back and talk about the fibers. There's 3 kinds of fibers. There's collagen. Well, collagen, when you look at it, it's sort of wavy and it's thick. It's like a cable almost. So if you want to go back to thinking about it like threads or something, this would be like yarn. It's thick, it's tough, it's strong. It resists pulling, it resists tension or tensile strength. And if you look at it, like I said, it's wavy. Well, in the body, it's white. But in order for us to see things on a slide, we usually stain them. And collagen usually stains pink. So if we go here and look at it, these pink fibers, these are collagen, these pink fibers. And look how thick they are compared to the rest of them. Big, thick fibers. So that's what gives a tissue its strength. That's what makes a tissue strong. And then there's another kind of fiber. These are called elastic or elastin fibers. And a good way to think about an elastic fiber is to think about a rubber band, because that's what they're like. They're like little elastic bands. They're thin fibers, and they stretch just like a rubber band does. But also just like a rubber band, if you let go of it, it's going to have recoil to it. So elastic fibers allow for stretch and recoil. So tissues with a lot of this, that's what they do. They stretch, but then they snap back to their original length. You stop pulling on them. If you look at them, they tend to be curly or wavy. And so if you drew one, it would be something like this. They have curls in them. In the body, they're yellow, but again, to see things, we have to stain them, and these usually are going to stain dark, almost black. So if we look in here, they're not black, but these are the elastic fibers. So these are the middle-sized fibers, and they look a little bit like hairs running through the tissue. And then we have a third kind of fiber, and these are called reticular fibers. So reticular comes from the same word as reticulum. And reticulum means network. It means a net, like a fish net. So if you think about what a fish net looks like, it looks like this. It's thin fibers, and it forms this sort of net like this. And that's exactly the way these fibers are. They form a very hard to see, very thin and diffuse fibers, but they also stain darkly. So in this picture, there are these that are hard to see. These right here. And they form, like I said, like a net in here. So those are the three types of fibers. Any questions about the three types of fibers? So we saw them on this picture. Now let's look at them here. So what do you think A is pointing to? Anybody know? What are these? That's right, these are the cells. And then B is these big pink things right here, pink things that you see. Now they look kind of blurred out, but they're big and thick. So what do you think B is pointing at? B is pointing at collagen, that's right. And then if you look at C, look, these wavy, dark staining fibers that you have in here. What do you think that is? That's elastic fibers. And then these very, very, very faint ones that you see in here. What are those? What is D? Those are reticular fibers. And it doesn't have a letter on it, but what do you think this stuff is in here? This sort of yellowish, clearest looking stuff in there. What is that? It's not a fiber. It is matrix, but which part of the matrix? Exactly, Jasmine. It's the ground substance. Remember, matrix has two parts to it. It has fibers, which we just saw, and then it also has this unstructured filler material called ground substance. And so when you look at this, you can see all of those. The only one that's not labeled would be something like here. If we were to add another letter, it would be like that. So this is kind of like a little self-quiz for you to do, and you can practice this kind of thing and then pick a different picture when we get to it and try to pick out those same items. So we go back to this one. I don't really like this picture that much because I wish they would have chosen different colors. But here's collagen. Collagen thick. It's like a cable. And there's elastin right there. And then here's the reticular fibers right here, these light blue ones. This is the ground substance here, and then we have cells. But look at these cells. Do all of these cells look alike to you? I mean, look at this cell versus this cell. They look very, very different. And that's another thing about connective tissues. We can have different types of cells in the same connective tissue. So different types. So connective tissue is different from those other tissues, quite different. Another thing about connective tissues is they all have a common origin. So they all have a cell which they come from. And so remember, we start out as a zygote, and then it begins to divide and divide and divide, and eventually we get tissue layers. There's 3 tissue layers. And then they're going to turn into our adult tissues. Well, there's a intermediate step for connective tissues. There's a cell or a tissue called mesenchyme, and mesenchyme is what's called undifferentiated connective tissue. What undifferentiated means is it kind of has not decided what it wants to be when it grows up. And so it has a lot of pathways it could take. And mesenchyme can become any connective tissue, any at all. They all have this same parent, if you want to call it that. It's actually called a stem or stem cell because it can become lots and lots and lots of different things. So like on a tree, it's the stem and then they branch out from it. So what's going to happen is mesenchyme is going to turn into another type of connective tissue. Priscilla says it's the one connective tissues come from. That's exactly right. All connective tissues come from this mesenchyme. And so what's going to happen is first the mesenchyme is going to turn into a cell, and then that cell is going to build the matrix, and then it will become whatever that connective tissue is. So when we look at it, we're going to see mesenchyme turn into cells first. And so we're going to look at cells of connective tissue. Well, cells are going to have a name. In that name, there's a suffix. And that suffix is going to tell you something about the cell. It's going to be something blast. Well, if it's a blast cell, it's a producing cell or a secreting cell. And so it's building something. It's building a connective tissue. But once it's built, once it's done building, somebody has to maintain it. And so what happens is the blast will turn into a cell which is called a site. And a site is a maintaining cell. And so it's going to maintain the tissue that's already built. So look at this one. Mesenchyme turns into this, fibroblast. Everybody remember what blast means? What does blast mean? It means secreting or building. Well, what does it look like a fibroblast is building? What are they secreting? Things we've already talked about. They're secreting fibers. What are the three kinds of fibers we talked about? Collagen. What else? Elastic and reticular fibers. So look, fibroblasts build fibers. Those fibers are those three fibers, and that's going to determine the matrix, and that's going to determine what tissue it is. Let's look at a different one. Let's look at this one down here. Look, osteoblasts. Anybody know what osteo means? What does osteo refer to? If you go to an osteopath physician, anybody know what it means? It means bone, that's right. So what do osteoblasts do? What does blast mean? Blast means building. So what are osteoblasts building? They're building bone. And so what we're going to get is the tissue called bone. Look at this one here. Adipose. Anybody know what adipose refers to? It refers to fat. And so what does blast mean? It means building. So we're building fat cells. There's one more here, chondro. We saw this when we talked about the regions. Remember the hypochondriac regions? Chondro means cartilage. So that means that chondroblasts are building cartilage. And then if you go back, what did we say site meant? Do you remember? What does site mean? It means maintaining. So what are they maintaining? Fibrocytes. What are they maintaining? They're maintaining fibers. What does chondro mean? Do you remember? It means cartilage. And what does site mean? It means maintaining. So they're maintaining cartilage. And then osteo. Remember, osteo means bone. Site means maintaining. They're maintaining bone. So when we look at this, all of these different tissues are going to have a different cell type. So tissues with a lot of fibers are going to have this cell type. Tissues of cartilage are going to have this cell type. Tissues of bone are going to have this cell type. Tissues of fat are going to have this cell type. And then the last one, hemocyto, refers to blood. So blood is going to have this cell type. Does it make sense to everyone? So look, if we look at it, here's mesenchyme up here. And so mesenchyme is going to differentiate. It's going to turn into a fibroblast. Fibroblasts build fibers. Fibrocytes maintain fibers. So these are the cells of the tissues with lots of fibers. And these are those tissues. Here's chondro. Chondro means cartilage. So it's going to turn into a chondroblast, build and maintain cartilage. And that's what we're going to get. We're going to get cartilages. And then remember osteo. What does osteo mean? It means bone. So these are the cells of bone, and they're going to build and maintain bone. And then here's the one for blood. So they're going to build and maintain blood. Make sense to everyone? So what we're going to wind up with are 4 types of connective tissues. 4 types. They are our connective tissues proper. It's a weird name, but really what it means, because it's called proper, is that they truly connect things. They truly connect things together. So they're sort of like ropes or something like that hold things together. And then we have cartilages. And then we have bone, and we have blood. But again, where does all this start? Remember, it starts as mesenchyme. So mesenchyme is this undifferentiated tissue. It can become any of these tissues. But in order to do that, it first has to turn into the cell that builds the tissue. And then the cell is going to produce the matrix, and we're going to get the tissues. Here are the connective tissues proper. Here are the cartilages. Here are the bones. And here is blood. Make sense to everyone? Anybody have any questions? So what we're going to do is we're going to look at these 4 different types of connective tissues individually. So one more time, we have the connective tissues proper. We have the cartilages, we have bones, and we have blood. So let's look at the connective tissues. And if you look at them on a flow chart, this is what they look like. So right here is where mesenchyme is. And so again, mesenchyme is going to differentiate, and it can become connective tissues proper. And it's going to do that by becoming a fibroblast. It can become cartilage, and it's going to do that by becoming a chondroblast. It can become bone. What's the cell it's going to be if it becomes bone? Anybody know? What's the prefix for bone? Osteo. So it's got to become an osteoblast to become bone. And then this is called the hemocytoblast. And then it's going to turn into these connective tissues. And so here are our connective tissues proper. And there's actually 6 of them. And here are our cartilages. There's 3 of them. And here's the bone. There's 2 of them. And then blood. And there's only 1 blood. What is adept again, sir? I don't know what. Oh, adipose. Adipose means fat. So adipose refers to fat. We'll see that in a second. Okay, so we're going to look at the connective tissues proper first. So remember, they're called connective tissues proper because they truly connect things. They connect things together. Well, there's 2 types of connective tissues proper. There's loose and there's dense. So let's go back to this. There's loose and there's dense. So before we start talking about these, I want you to get the word loose in your head. What does that sound like? Does loose sound like soft or hard? What does it sound like? Loose. Soft or hard? Like it's dense, or does it sound like it's spread out? Which one? Yeah, that's what it's like. Think about it. It's soft. It's spread out. That's what these tissues are like. So you should be able to picture that in your head. There's 3 of these. There's one called irregular, or you can call it areolar. Irregular. There's one called adipose. Remember, that's fat. And then there's one called reticular. So these are the 3 loose connective tissues proper. So that means they're going to be soft. That means they're going to be spread out. And so let's look at these. Let's look at irregular first. So if you look at irregular connective tissue, it's got all of the characteristics that we've been talking about. Remember, it's got cells. The cells are fibroblasts. Now, there are other cells here too, but primarily fibroblasts. What do fibroblasts do? They build fibers. And what we're going to see in the matrix is there's all 3 types of fibers, all 3. What are the 3 types of fibers? Remember, they're collagen, so we're going to see collagen. We're going to see elastic fibers. We're going to see reticular fibers. It has all 3 in it. And then there's a ground substance. And the ground substance here is like jelly. It's like jello. So think about jelly. Jelly is soft and squishy. That's what it's like. And that's what this is like too. That's what this ground substance is like. So when you look at it, it's got a soft, squishy, gel-like matrix with all 3 different fibers running through it. And the cells are primarily fibroblasts. So think about that, soft and squishy with all 3 types of fibers. It's going to be a shock-absorbing type tissue, and that's exactly what it does. It wraps itself around tissues and organs and cushions them. And so this is what it looks like. So here's our box. Remember, this came out of the lab book. There's our picture. There's the diagram right there. And then here's the description, the location, and the function. So again, everything you need to know about this tissue is right here in this box. Well, look at this picture. You should be able already to pick out a bunch of stuff. Remember, the primary cell type here are fibroblasts. So that's what these are. They're fibroblasts. And then here's our ground substance. Remember, it's like jelly or jello. And then look, these big pink fibers, those are collagen. These really, really dark staining fibers are elastin. And even though they're not labeled, these really, really fine fibers here, those are reticular fibers. So in other words, this is what this tissue looks like. You blow it up, it looks like this. So look, here are fibroblasts. But this is not a fibroblast. Look at it. That's a different kind of cell. We can have other cells in here as well. But mostly what we have are fibroblasts. And then here's those pink fibers. What are the pink fibers? Anybody remember? Big, thick, pink fibers. What are they? Collagen, yeah. And then here's these dark staining fibers. What are the dark staining fibers? Elastin. And then these really faint fibers that are really hard to see in here. Those are reticular. And that's the tissue. So that is areolar connective tissue. Areolar or areolar connective tissue. Any questions about it? So look at another one. Let's look at adipose connective tissue. Most of the time we just call this fat. Well, adipose connective tissue is a little bit different from most connective tissues because it has not much extracellular material. There's only a little bit of extracellular material. So there's only a little bit of matrix. What we have are cells. And remember, we're going to start with the cells. They're going to be adipoblasts. So an adipoblast is going to produce fat. Well, if you look at an adipoblast, they start out looking like a normal cell. So they start out like this, just a plain old normal cell. And there's the nucleus in the middle. But then the cell begins to build fat, and the fat collects inside the cell. It's a liquid fat droplet. And so the cell is going to get bigger, and the nucleus and the cytoplasm get pushed off to the side. And so here's the liquid droplet right there. And then it gets even bigger as it adds more fat, and the nucleus gets pushed even further to the side. And then it gets bigger until you wind up with these big giant cells that are basically just a little package full of a liquid fat. And then they maintain that fat, and so they're called adipocytes. So this tissue is all about fat. It's all about making fat, storing fat, and so on. So fat has a lot of calories in it. It has 9 calories per gram. 9 calories. That's almost more than twice as much of everything else. Proteins and carbohydrates only have 4 calories per gram. And so that means you can store twice or more than twice as much energy in the same space. And so we use fat to store energy. So it's our reserve of energy storage. Fat, though, also does not transmit heat very well. And so fat is insulating. So it keeps heat in or it keeps heat out. And then it's soft. It's shock absorbing. And so because it's soft or shock absorbing, you can put it in places that might get hit and they would hurt. And so it's also good for protection and support. And so we find it in lots and lots of places. Anywhere where we're going to store fat, anywhere where we need insulation, and then also around organs to support and protect them. So these are the places we find it. Well, when you look at it, remember the cells look like this. So there's a nucleus way over here to the side, and then there's all this fat. So this is what one cell looks like right here. There's the nucleus, and here's the fat. And that's true for all of these. There's the nucleus, and there's the fat. If we blow that up, it looks like this. So this is one cell. And look how the nucleus has been pushed way over to the side. And all of this is a liquid fat. Liquid fat. And so a good way to imagine what these look like is to think about bubble wrap. Everybody in here familiar with bubble wrap? Think about what you use bubble wrap for. You wrap up things that are delicate, that might break or get damaged. And what it does is it absorbs shock. It's shock absorbing. But it's not got air in it like bubble wrap. It's got fat in it. So imagine bubble wrap full of fat, and that's what adipose connective tissue is like. Make sense to everyone? Now, if you look at this picture, look how weird the cell shape looks. That's because the fat has been removed. And when you remove the fat, the cells sort of shrivel a little bit. So you can see how they look shriveled. When the fat's in there, they look like this. They're plump. So, we go back. That is, again, start again with this mesenchyme, turn into these adipoblasts. Adipoblasts produce the fat, and we got adipose tissue. Okay, let's look at the next one. So the next one is reticular connective tissue. So remember what that word means. Reticular means network, like a net. And so we're going to have a net inside tissues. And so it looks like this in there. It's like a net running through the tissues. And what it does is it forms like a sort of soft support system. Sort of like a soft skeleton. So if I took and I put that inside an organ, so here's my whole organ, and it's got that stuff running through it, it would support my organ. And a good way to think about this is to think about like pillow stuffing. So think about pillow stuffing. It supports the pillow. It's soft, so when you lay your head on it, it's supportive, it's squishy, just like a pillow. And there's a lot of spaces in here in between. And in those spaces, we can put cells. Now, these are not the cells of reticular tissue. These are spaces for other cells. And so this organ could be the liver. And so that would be liver cells in here. But the organ could be the spleen. And so there would be spleen cells in here. But that organ could be a lymph node. And so these would be lymph cells in here. So what it does is you find it inside organs, and it provides this soft internal skeleton. That soft internal skeleton is called stroma. And so reticular fibers, reticular connective tissue forms stroma. And so we're going to find it in lots of organs, but every single one of these organs is going to have this soft, supportive internal skeleton. So if we look at it, here is our internal skeleton right here, this. And look, it's just running through here. And look, it's got lots of spaces for cells. Well, these cells are not all the same. Look, that cell is different from that cell. But these are the cells of this particular organ. And this particular organ is the spleen. And the spleen has tons of white blood cells in it. And so what we're seeing here are a bunch of different white blood cells. If we blow that up, it looks like this. It looks a lot like, I don't know, a sponge maybe. Think about a sponge that you might have in your kitchen. It's soft, it's squishy, there's a lot of spaces in it, and it's supportive. You can support something as long as it's not too heavy. You can support it with the sponge. Any questions about that tissue? So again, this is reticular connective tissue. So those are the three loose ones. So the three loose ones, remember, are irregular, adipose, and this one, which is reticular. So again, loose. So remember what we said? It was soft and it was spread out and supportive. Make sense? Okay, but we also have three dense connective tissues proper. So now, think about the word dense. Which one does that sound like? Does it sound like soft, or does it sound like more firm? Does it sound spread out, or does it sound like dense? Well, it's in the name, dense. So that's what we're going to see. We're not going to see this soft spread out like we did over here. We're going to see firm, dense, strong tissue. And again, there are three of these as well. There's dense regular, there's dense irregular, and then there's elastic. So let's look at these. Dense regular, dense irregular, and elastic. Let's look at dense regular first. So dense regular, dense tells you it's dense, and regular. Well, what regular means is that it has fibers in it, and the fibers are all arranged in a regular pattern. They're very, very regular. In other words, they're all parallel to each other. Now, mostly what we have in here is collagen. There's some elastin, but the fibers are parallel. Every single one of them runs in the same direction. There are none that run in a different direction. And if you look at it, look at these fibers. You can see them here. They have a wave to them. But look, every single one of them has a wave. They're all parallel to each other. There are no fibers running this way, and there are no fibers running this way. There are none running. They're all running just like this. They're all arranged in this regular pattern. The cell is going to be fibroblasts because fibroblasts are going to build the fibers. And again, most of the fibers are going to be collagen. So this tissue is going to be very strong. There are a few elastic fibers. So it has a little bit of elasticity to it, just a little, not much. It's mostly strong. And a good way to think about dense regular is to think about a rope. So think about a rope. A rope is a whole bunch of fibers that are together, and all those fibers together make that rope strong. And it's strong enough you can pull a car with a rope. You can tie up a boat with a rope. You can do a bunch of things with a rope. We can tie things together. And that's exactly what it does. It ties or binds things together. And so we find it in the ropes in our body. And the ropes in our body are ligaments and tendons and aponeuroses. A ligament is a rope that connects a bone to a bone. There's something holding these bones together, and it's a rope-like structure. It binds them together, it ties them together. We also have tendons, and tendons connect a muscle to a bone. So here's a muscle, and then there's a bone, and there's a tendon that connects the two together. And so it's a rope that holds the muscle to the bone. And then the last one is an aponeurosis. And what an aponeurosis does is it ties a muscle to a muscle. So here's one muscle, here's another muscle, and an aponeurosis is a rope that connects the two, holds them together. Again, the cells are fibroblasts and the main fibers are collagen. So when we look at this picture, most of what we see is collagen. And then here are the fibroblasts. Again, all of the collagen fibers are parallel to each other. So if you pull on this way, it's very, very, very strong. Tendons connect muscles to bones. So look, if I pull on it this way, it's very, very, very strong. And it resists that pulling, it resists that tension. But if you pull on it this way, what do you think would happen if I pull on it this way? Look at it. What do you think is going to happen? Anybody want to guess? It's going to come apart. It's going to pull apart because there aren't any fibers running this way. And look, when I pull it, these little spaces are going to get bigger. These fibers are going to get separated. They're going to pull apart. So in this direction, it's actually weak. So in other words, ligaments and tendons are strong in one direction, but they're weak in a different direction. So how do you go about tearing a tendon or tearing a ligament? What kind of movement or injury, or what has to happen to you? It has to be something that applies pressure in the wrong direction. Otherwise, tendons and ligaments are very, very strong. But you hear about people tearing ligaments and you hear about people tearing tendons. But look what has to happen. The pressure has to come from this direction, because it's weak that way. This way it's very, very, very strong. Does it make sense to everyone? So that's dense, regular connective tissue. Let's look at dense, irregular. So if regular meant that the fibers were all parallel, irregular is going to mean that the fibers are running every which way, and they do. So the fibers are just different. They're running in different patterns. But other than that, the tissue is pretty much the same. It's still fibroblast. It's still almost all collagen with a little bit of elastin. It's just now the fibers don't run in this pattern. They run every which way. And so look at this. If they're running every which way, it doesn't matter which way I pull on it. It's going to have some fibers to resist it. And so it resists tension or pulling in all directions. Not like the one we saw before, which resists tension in a single direction. This one does it in all directions. But it's not as strong as a tendon. It's not as strong as dense, regular connective tissue. So this is not like a rope. It's more like a sheet of cloth, maybe like canvas or something. If you think about canvas, it's a sheet, and the fibers run every which way in that sheet. And you can do a lot of stuff with this canvas. You can make sails out of it. You can wrap stuff in it. But it's not as strong as the ropes that we've seen holding it together. Would not be as strong as the ropes. And so when we look at this tissue, look, here are those fibers. Look, and they're running everywhere. There's no pattern in here. Look, that one's running like this, and that one's running this way, and you just can't see a pattern because they're running every direction. But other than that, the tissue is exactly the same as the other one. So we don't find it in ligaments and tendons. Where you find this tissue is in the skin around your body. So you find it in the dermis, the skin. You find it wrapped around your organs. So in organ capsules. You find it wrapped around your joints, so joint capsules. And that's what this is here. This is a joint capsule. So look, it's like a sheet of canvas or a sheet of cloth wrapped around this joint to protect the joint, to hold everything in place. But here's a ligament right here. And this is not as strong as the ligament. If we blow this up, it looks like this. So look at all these fibers, and again, they're running every which way imaginable. And then when you make a section and you cut them, some of them are long, so we get a longitudinal section. Some of them are round, some of them are twisted, all different sections in all different directions. Any questions about dense, irregular? Okay, well, we have one more dense connective tissue. This one's called elastic. connective tissue. So the difference here is that there's a lot less collagen and a lot more elastin. So more elastic fibers. And so this tissue is going to be more stretchy, more stretch, more recoil. And so that's what it does. It's like a big, big rubber band that stretches and recoils all day long. If you think about yourself holding a rubber band between your hands and just stretching it constantly and then releasing it, stretch, release, it's going to go this way and then it's going to go this way. Well, the tissues that do that are constantly being stretched and released, and they sort of pulse. Everybody in here probably is familiar with what we call our pulse on our arteries. Everybody see if you can find your pulse. So if you look at your hand right here, on your thumb side, and here's your wrist, put your finger right there and see if you can feel a pulse. And you can also do it on your neck and other places, but this is probably the easiest place to find it. Remember, it's on the thumb side. Can everybody find it? Well, what you're feeling is an artery. That artery, as the blood goes through it from the heart, as the blood goes through there, oops, I erased it. As the blood goes through there, the walls bulge out. So here comes the blood pushing, and it pushes the walls out. And you can feel that bulging out. So it's like the rubber band stretching. And then as the blood goes by, what happens is it squeezes back in until the next heartbeat and the next blood going through there. And so that's what happens. It pulses. The walls pulse. So you find this in places where that happens. So you find it in large arteries. You also find it in the lungs. There are these tubes in the lungs called bronchi that air moves through. And they also stretch and then go back in, stretch and go back in. They also pulse. So we still have fibroblasts. That's still our cell, but now they're going to make a lot less collagen and a lot more elastin. And so, again, this is going to be a stretchy tissue. And so if we look at it, we're going to see that. So if we look in here, the pink fibers, we already know pink is collagen. But look how many of these dark staining fibers there are in here now. Just tons of it. And remember, they are wavy or curly, sort of. And so here it's been relaxed. This is relaxed. But if you stretch it, if you push on it, all those fibers are just like a rubber band, are going to stretch. And then when you stop pushing, they're going to squeeze back in. And so when we look here, the black fibers, the dark staining fibers, are the elastic fibers. These pink ones are collagen. Now there's also this in here, which if you remember we talked about smooth muscle, that's smooth muscle. But these fibers in here, that's collagen and elastin. So if we blow that up even more, it looks like this. So these are easy to see. So here's collagen, and here is elastin. So to me, this looks a lot like frying bacon. So that might help you to remember what it looks like. It looks like bacon. Any questions? Lisa, the pink is collagen. Remember, it's white in the body, but it stains usually pink. So all of this pink stuff. Okay, so those are our 6 connective tissues proper. We had 3 loose and 3 dense. Again, fibroblasts are going to build these tissues because fibroblasts build fibers. Okay, let's move on. Let's look at cartilages. So if we come over here, remember we're going to start with mesenchyme, but what it's going to do now is it's going to change into chondroblasts. Chondro means cartilage, and so these are going to build cartilage. And there are 3 types of cartilages. So we have hyaline cartilage, we have fibrous cartilage, and we have elastic cartilage. So let's look at these. So cartilages are a little bit different from most connective tissues. For one thing, they're extremely dense, extremely. So they're packed in there like crazy. And because they're so dense, everything's packed like crazy, that the cells have to have a space to fit in. And so if you look at cartilages, you're going to see little holes in the tissue. And in the hole is where the cells are. The hole is called a lacuna. Lacunae means little lake. So there are these little holes, and then inside the lacuna is where the cells are going to be. And then we're going to have fibers, and the fibers are, again, packed together like crazy because it's dense. So these are the fibers out here, and they're so densely packed that sometimes they're hard to see. It just looks solid. Another thing about cartilages is they have no blood vessels. There's not a single blood vessel in cartilage. The blood vessels are on the outside edge. They're in a connective tissue membrane that surrounds cartilage. And that membrane is called the perichondrium. Peri means around. It's made out of dense, irregular connective tissue, that thing we just talked about a second ago. So if we look at cartilage, we're going to see fibers densely packed. We're going to see the cells, and the cells are chondroblasts and chondrocytes. And they're going to be located in these little spaces called lacunae. So when we look at it, let's look at a picture first. It looks like this. So look, I can't really see fibers in here, but they're there. They're so densely packed that there's no space between them. And because there's no space between them, you can't pick out individual fibers. So all of this is fibers. They're just so densely packed. They're like this. And you can't see an individual one. And then look, there's the lacuna right there, and there's the lacuna. And then here is the chondroblast, or the chondrocyte. So let's look at hyaline cartilage first. So hyaline cartilage is the most common type of cartilage. It's found in lots of places on the body. And hyaline cartilage you probably have come into contact with if you eat meat. Sometimes you get something from meat in your mouth that you just cannot chew up. We call it gristle. That's hyaline cartilage. Or if you eat ribs, any kind of like beef ribs or something, on the end of the bone, there's this white, tough thing. That's hyaline cartilage. Or if you eat chicken and the chicken breast and the middle of it, there's a white, flexible like thing. That's hyaline cartilage. So hyaline cartilage, when you look at it, it's flexible. It's firm, but it's also bendy. It's flexible. The fibers are so tightly packed in there that you can't see them. You can't perceive them. They're imperceptible. And so you can't see individual fibers. They're densely, densely packed. We're going to have these cells. The cells are chondrocytes. They're in lacunae. And so what we're going to find with hyaline cartilage is, like I said, it's everywhere. It's in your nose. So if you feel your nose, now it's got bone up at the top, but most of it is cartilage. It's in your trachea. If you run your finger down the front of your throat, you'll feel bumps all the way down. It's in your voice box, which is your Adam's apple. It's on the ends of the ribs. It's also on the ends of all long bones. So it's like a cap on the ends of all long bones. So it's all over the place. And again, here's our box. So there's the picture. Here's our diagram, description, location, and function. And if we blow this up, it looks like this. I think this looks like Swiss cheese. So maybe that would help you remember. It looks a lot like Swiss cheese because it has holes in it. But the holes, remember, are called lacunae. And the cell is inside the lacuna. That's a chondroblast or a chondrocyte. And then here's our matrix, and it's got fibers, but the fibers are so densely packed that you can't see individual fibers. So you can't really see them, but that's where they are. Looks like that. Any questions about collagen? About hyaline cartilage? Okay, let's look at another kind of cartilage. This is called elastic cartilage. So it's almost just like hyaline, except it's got a lot more elastic fibers. Well, more elastic means it's going to have stretch and it's going to have recoil to it. So it's very similar to hyaline, except it's got stretch and recoil. Now, you don't have much of this in the body. The most obvious place is in your ear, your external ear. Everybody feel your ear. So if this is the side of your head, here's your ear, and it's got these ridges in it and so on. All of that, those ridges and all that, that's this hyaline cartilage. Elastic cartilage. And if you fold your ear down, everybody just fold your ear down and then let go of it. And what it's going to do as soon as you let go is it's going to pop back to its original position. It's got recoil to it. It's not going to slowly go back up. It's going to pop back up like a rubber band snaps. Another place you find elastic cartilage is in the epiglottis. And the epiglottis is the little trap door that keeps food out of your trachea. And so the food slides past it into the esophagus. But as soon as you swallow, it folds down, but when you stop swallowing, it pops back up again so you can breathe. And then again, we're going to have chondrocytes, we're going to have lacunae, but we're going to see elastic fibers. And remember, elastic fibers stain dark. So when we see this, we're going to see these dark staining fibers. And there they are. Here are these dark staining fibers right here. Those are elastic fibers. And there's our chondrocyte with our lacunae. And then lots and lots and lots of these dark staining fibers. Again, mostly in the ear and in the epiglottis. If we blow that up, it looks like this. So look at all these elastic fibers in here. All of these black things, dark things. That's all elastic fibers in there. All of this stuff. Remember, cartilages have a perichondrium. They don't have any blood vessels. Here's the perichondrium right here. So that's not cartilage. That's the perichondrium, and that's where the blood vessels are. Remember, cartilage has no blood vessels at all. So it has to get its nutrition by diffusion. It has to diffuse from these blood vessels in the perichondrium. And then we have one more kind of cartilage, and this is called fibro or fibrous cartilage. The reason it's called that is because the fibers are easy to see. The fibers are very visible. And the fibers here are collagen again. But the collagen fibers are very thick, they're very coarse, they're very easy to see. They're also spread out, so they're easy to see for that reason too. Again, we're going to have chondrocytes, we're going to have lacunae, but this tissue is very, very, very strong tissue. It's very strong. And because it's spread out, it can absorb pressure. And it looks like this. Well, there we go. It looks like this. So remember I said collagen tends to stain pink? Well, in this tissue, it's wrong. It's collagen tends to stain blue in this tissue because we use a different stain. But that is collagen. And then there's our lacunae with our chondrocytes in it. If we blow it up, it looks like this. So all of these blue fibers, those are collagen. And then there's our cells in the lacunae. And so if you look at it, again, it's a very strong tissue and it can absorb shock or absorb compression. So where you find it is like in the back. If you look at the vertebrae, they're stacked up on top of each other like this. But there's a disc in between them. And the disc is made out of this fibrocartilage. And what it does is it holds the spine together, but it also absorbs shock. So if you jump up and down, the bones don't hit each other. They have hit this cushion, and it absorbs the shock. You also find it in the knee. You also find it between the two pubic bones. So that is fibrocartilage. So, any questions about cartilage? There's three of them: hyaline, elastic, and fibrocartilage. Any questions? Okay, let's look at bone. So there's two types of bone. There's what we call compact, it's also called dense, and then there's spongy bone. And their names kind of describe them. And you don't even need a microscope to be able to tell them apart. So look, this is a bone that's been cut in half. And it's easy to see that this bone right here is very, very, very dense. There are no spaces in it. It's dense. compact or dense bone. But look over here. There's thousands and thousands and thousands of little tiny holes, little spaces. And that is spongy bone. If you look here, it's easy to see dense bone versus spongy bone. If you look at this, spongy bone is never on the surface. Never, unless there's something wrong. It's never on the surface. It's covered up. It's covered up by dense bone or compact bone. That's always on the surface. And you can see it in this picture as well. So look, there's no spongy bone exposed anywhere. It's inside. Spongy bone is inside. And dense bone is here on the surface. Well, we're going to spend a lot of time talking about bone later on. So for now, we're just going to kind of look at it in sort of a cursory way. But remember, we're going to start out with mesenchyme. And so mesenchyme, remember, the cells are going to turn into osteoblasts. And then the osteoblasts are going to lay down the matrix. And so the matrix is going to be hard. It's got calcium in it. So the matrix is mineralized. It's also got fibers in it, collagen. But those collagen fibers have minerals encrusted on them. And so this tissue is rigid, it's hard, it's stiff. We're also going to see that we have lacunae here, just like we did with cartilage. And so remember, lacunae is a space. It means little lake. And we're going to see that the cells are going to be located inside the lacunae, just like before. Well, when we look at bone, we mostly look at bone that's already built. And so, remember, it's not going to be osteoblasts, it's going to be osteocytes, because those are the ones that maintain bone. And so because bone is hard and stiff and strong, it's good at doing these things. It's supportive, it's protective, you can use it to pull on. It also has got a lot of calcium and minerals in it, and so we can use it to store those. So if we look at bone, it looks like this. Now if we look at this bone, this is dead bone. So somebody dug this up out of a grave or something. It's dead. There's no cells in it at all. They're all gone. All that's left is the matrix. So they dug it up, they ground it down until it was very, very, very thin, and then they poured ink on it. And what that ink does is it goes into every little crack, every little space, every little hole. So if we look at this, anywhere that's black is where that ink went. So look, those are spaces. Those are spaces. These little tiny things are spaces. Every little crack, every little hole is filled up with this ink. Well, when you look at this, now this one is not as inky, but when you look at this, it looks a lot like a bunch of trees that have been cut down. Look, that looks like a tree stump. And there's another tree stump, and there's another one. And then it looks a little bit like bugs are crawling all over the tree stumps. Well, this stump, if you will, is the unit of bone. And these little things that look like bugs, those are the lacunae where the cells would be located. And the cells would be osteocytes. But remember, there's no cells in here. This is dead bone. So if we look at this one, same thing. Those are the lacunae right here. So here's one tree stump. And here's another one. Again, that's the unit of bone. And we'll talk about it more when we get to bones. But there's a big black space in the middle, and then there's lots of these little tiny places where the cells sit. Those are called the lacunae, and so on. And so when you look at this, there's that big one in the middle. Here's the lacunae. And look, you even have these little streaks. Those are also little spaces that are filled up with this ink. And they radiate out like this. And they connect these together. So they connect this one to this one, or this one to this one. But nothing else looks like bone. So nobody ever misses this. So don't be the first one to miss it. Spongy bone looks like this. So look at all of these holes in here. So these holes, these spaces, are where we can put stuff. And so what happens in spongy bone, in these spaces, this is where blood cells are produced. So blood cells are not made by bone. It just happens to be inside the bone. But spongy bone does not look like dense bone. It's got these big empty spaces, or spaces with stuff in it. So it also is really easy to pick out. Any questions about bone? So remember, we had two types: dense or compact, and spongy. We only have one more tissue, and that is blood. So blood is a weird tissue because it's a liquid tissue. It's a liquid connective tissue, which means that the matrix is water. So the matrix is mostly water. It's about 92% water. Now, it's not just water. It's also got proteins in it, and salts, and all sorts of nutrients and waste products and all that kind of stuff in there too. Tons of ions. So it's not just water. It's got a lot of stuff in it. So we call it plasma. So if you centrifuge blood, it'll separate, and you can get the liquid part of blood up at the top, and that's the plasma. And then the cells, which are heavier, will wind up down at the bottom. Well, there are three different kinds of cells in blood. There are red blood cells, and they are red even without staining them. White blood cells. White blood cells aren't really white, but they're not red. And these, when you stain them, they change color. And so we're going to see blue, and we're going to see red, and we're going to see purple. They're not that color. That's the color of the stain. And then we have these little bitty things called platelets. And so blood flows through the blood vessels. And because it flows through the blood vessels, it can carry stuff with it. And so the main job of blood is transport. So we transport all kinds of things: nutrients, waste products, gases, all sorts of stuff, hormones. We transport it. And then blood also has white blood cells in it, which help fight off disease. And then blood also has platelets in it, which help with clotting. So when you look at blood, here's the plasma right here. That's liquid. Again, it's mostly water. And just like any watery substance, you can pour it, you can move it, it can flow, and that's what happens. It flows through blood vessels. And then here are the red blood cells. So that's a red blood cell, that's a red blood cell, that one, they're all red. And then if you notice, there's something weird about red blood cells. They don't have a nucleus. So sometimes they look like donuts. but it's not a hole, it's just thinner there. If you look at them from the side, they're shaped like this. They're thin in the middle. And then here's a white blood cell. White blood cells do have a nucleus. And then here's another white blood cell, and it does have a nucleus. There's only one kind of red blood cell. They're all the same, one type, but there are 5 types of white blood cells. And so they're not going to look all alike. If I look at this one, it doesn't look anything like this one over here. And then here is a platelet, little bitty thing. So here's another picture. There's a red blood cell, and you can see that sunk in area right there. That's what I was talking about. There's a white blood cell, and then here's a platelet. So, red blood cells, tons of them. There's a platelet. And in this picture, you can see plasma, you can see white blood cells, and you can see platelets. And then, of course, tons and tons of red blood cells. Any questions? So that's it for the tissues. That's the end of histology. So we will have a lecture quiz over histology, and maybe a little bit from that first lecture, but it's mostly over histology. So I haven't created that quiz yet, so it'll show up sometime, but probably not for a while. Any questions? Okay, well, thank you for coming, and if you come back at 1, I'll see you then. Yasmin says, will the quiz be put up today? Yes, later today. Look for them generally around 4 p.m. is when they show up. That's usually they show up. Anybody else have a question? Okay, well, we'll stop there.